Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure it's been a busy morning for you all. Now it's time for a bit of a break. Up next is the lunch keynote presentation, When Project Management Becomes Team Leadership, presented by Tom Morin. My name is Denise Brown, and I'll be your session chair for our next session. Just a few housekeeping items before we start. Please remember to mute your microphone so that there's no background noise for any reason for Tom to get distracted. And if you've got a question, please type it in our chat and our session moderator will ask the questions at the end of the session. The Southern Alberta Institute of Technology is excited to welcome Tom Morin to the inaugural International Project Management Day Symposium. After his military service, Tom earned an engineering technology diploma from SAIT before leading technology and project teams in the Canadian energy industry for over 20 years. Tom has delivered enterprise-wide projects spanning several disciplines, including information technology, process automation, regulatory compliance, and occupational health and safety. Now, Tom teaches project and change management at SAIT, instructs change management at Mount Royal University and at Bow Valley College, and is an associate faculty member at the Royal Roads University in Victoria. He is a doctoral candidate at Royal Roads University, where he's also a recipient of the Royal Roads University Founders Award. He also holds Prosky Change Management Certification and university certificates in change management, human resources, executive coaching, and adult education. Tom maintains an active consulting practice through workfeelsgood.com, and his first book about work, titled Your Best Work, Create the Working Life That's Right for You, was published in 2020. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Tom Morin.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I think we can stop the screen share of the slide that we were waiting on. Perfect, thank you. I'm here today to talk about something that I know is not only important to me, but to so many people in the audience. As project managers, and I see there's almost 60 people in the audience right now, we are engaged in leadership almost on a daily basis. But I'm going to talk about something different today. And what I'd like to talk about is the exact moment, the point in time where people turn to you and demand that leadership of you. So every day we act as leaders and we know what those values are, but there are certain moments, and I call those critical moments, when we're called on to be leaders. Now, to talk about this, I'm going to begin with something that happened to me well over 25 years ago during my military service, and I was just deployed to the former Yugoslavia. I'm going to talk about what happened on a night patrol. And while I'm doing that, I'd like you to remember a couple things, and I'll begin with showing you one slide here. Just a moment. Here we go. So in the slide that I'm showing you, you see soldiers leaving on an armored personnel carrier for a patrol. This is what it looks like when you go on a patrol. And when I tell my story, I'd like you to remember two things. And I'll just mention those two things right now, so maybe you can even write them down. So the first thing I'd like you to remember is that while I'm telling you this story, you actually can't know what's going to happen next because I haven't told you, and hopefully you haven't heard this story before. So just keep that in mind. You can't know what's going to change for me. Another thing that I'd like you to keep in mind as I'm telling this story is that I had actually never met all those soldiers that I see in the photograph right now. All those soldiers, not only in the photograph, this photograph was taken at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and my night patrol would start about 8 o'clock that evening. But all the soldiers I'm going on patrol with, as I said, I've never met them. I'll tell you why at the end. But if you just keep those two things in mind, you can't know what's going to happen. And I've never met any of those soldiers before. So when I look at this photograph, I still see routine. And by that, I mean, I don't see critical activities. I don't see a critical moment. Like I say, this was taken in the former Yugoslavia. I took the photograph at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and all those soldiers going on this patrol right in this photograph are having a routine day. And I can tell that because they're not wearing helmets. And because they don't have helmets on, I know they're not getting shelled in that moment. There's no mortars, there's no artillery. Also, they're sitting on the back of the track. We call it tracks. Its correct name is Armored Personnel Carrier, or APCs, but soldiers love one-syllable words. So that is a track. And they're sitting on the track as they're leaving the compound, talking about their day, getting ready, very routine. They're not getting shot at. If they were getting shot at, they would, of course, be inside the Armored Personnel Carrier. Now, there's something that I'd like to talk about also while I'm telling this story, and it doesn't sit well with a certain industry. And that industry is the North American leadership development industry. And here's what I tell that industry. I say, you're doing a good job of preparing people to lead when it's routine, but you do a poor job to prepare people in critical moments. Now, before I go into detail on how they're doing, I want to show you what I mean by critical moments. Let's have another look at another slide here. Just bringing it up always takes a few clicks. And you should see the slide coming up in a moment. Yeah, here I am, and here's the slide. So right here, you see my favorite chart. It's a normal curve, a bell curve. And at the far end of the chart, you see the words not good enough. So there's all kinds of things in our daily lives that are quite critical, but we're not very good at them. So we avoid those things. I'll give you an example. I don't go base jumping. I'm no good at it. It's too critical. So I'm not about to jump off a building or a mountain with a parachute on. So I avoid those things. And I do that in my working life too. There's things I'm not good at that are critical to organizations, and I make sure I never take on those jobs. They go to somebody else. A great one would be accounting. I'm definitely not an accountant. Critical task in an organization, and there's people that are very good at that. But in the middle of the chart, you see the majority of things we do. And most of what we do, we only have to be good enough most of the time at it. Now, that, just to emphasize that, there's all kinds of things that you did today already where you only had to be good enough most of the time. You probably got up from your desk, went into the kitchen, got your lunch, and came down and sit down and watch this keynote speech. That's fantastic. I would say you're pretty good at getting your lunch and coming back. And let's say you made a mistake. Let's say you, I don't know, grabbed a Oreo cookie when you wanted a chocolate chip cookie. Those little mistakes have almost no consequences, let's hope. And you got a chance to go back and do it again. You can go into the kitchen, grab a different cookie, and come and sit down. So really, you only have to be good enough most of the time at that task. There's a whole bunch of things we do at work too, where we only have to be good enough most of the time. In my leadership roles, in my project management roles, sure, I made mistakes, but most of the times when I made a mistake, I got a do-over. I could do the work again. And we know that that's how we get through life. Majority of things, we just got to be good enough at them and our life progresses. Now, on the far side of the chart, towards me, you'll see where I say good enough most of the time isn't enough. So there's a lot of things that you do, for example, driving down the highway. Just being good enough most of the time at driving down the highway isn't good enough. You've got to get that right every time. The consequences of failure are too high. And in our leadership roles, our day isn't filled with those, but we have them. In our project management roles, our days aren't filled with these tasks, but we have them. So when I say to the leadership development industry, you're doing a good job at preparing people for their routine leadership roles, what I'm actually saying is you're doing good enough when being good enough is enough. So they're good at that. But I tell them they're failing to prepare people to lead in critical moments. And then, of course, they say, Tom, you're being kind of critical of us. Can you really give us an example? Because they often get confused by my bell curve. So I say, no problem, no problem. Let me tell you my story. So in 1993, I was deployed to the former Yugoslavia. And the former Yugoslavia at that time was a place where ethnic cleansing was going on. And I just want you to look at this photograph. It's on my right here, so I'm just going to look over there as I talk about it. You see some snow on the ground. That photograph was taken in March in what was central Yugoslavia. It's now Bosnia. And you can see buildings in the background. Every one of those buildings is burned. It is burned from the first floor all the way up to the top floor. And town after town, city after city, farmland, outbuildings, you name it, burned, burned, burned. So it's uninhabitable. Those buildings, you can't live in them. But that's not the key to ethnic cleansing. What ethnic cleansing is not making anything uninhabitable. What it is making sure nobody has something to come back to. That's the key. And I just want to show you how that happens. So in this next photograph, you'll see a nice small house, Central European home with all these bullet holes in it. That normally happens at night. If people were living in that town, the other side would pull up in their vehicles. They would strafe the houses with machine gun fire and get everybody outside. And then they would say, start walking and don't come back. But we know they did a lot worse than that. In the former Yugoslavia, when I got there in 1993, thousands of people had already been killed. Before these wars would be over, right around the year 2000, thousands more would be killed. But when I look at that photograph of the last house that had the machine gun holes in it, I don't see something that's completely uninhabitable. I see something there that someone could come back to. And one of the elements, one of the things that gave people the courage to come back to their towns was that there'd be Canadian soldiers on the street at night patrolling, keeping the bad people out and protecting the good people. And that's what I was doing. So the night I'd like to tell you about is one of those nights where we went on patrol. And I'll just mention this for everybody in the audience. There's 5 people that are on a patrol normally in an armored personnel carrier, like the first photograph I showed you. There's the sergeant who's in charge. There's a master corporal, and that was me. And there's a driver who's really only going to be driving the vehicle. And then there's 2 other soldiers. So there's 4 of us, including the sergeant, who are those soldiers who are going to be out on patrol. So we get ready for our patrol, do all those routine things. And about 8 o'clock in the evening, we start driving towards our town. And again, I just want to show you what that looks like when you're driving towards one of those towns. We're passing building after building, town after town that looks like this. You can see the smoke marks above the windows. You can see that there's no roofs on most of the buildings. Whenever you burn a house down, these heavy tile roofs that are supported on timbers just collapse into the building. Town after town, building after building, burned. So we're driving towards this town, and it's one of those towns that had a few of those buildings that someone would come back to. And we were there to make it safe for them to do that. So we're driving towards the town. Eventually, we're about 200 meters outside of the town, small village. The armored personnel carrier stops. The sergeant looks to the driver and he says, stay on the radio and stay in the track. It means stay in the vehicle. Then he looks at myself and the other two soldiers and he says, dismount. Dismount means get out. So we get out of the track. We line up on the road like soldiers do, staggered on either side of the pavement, about 20 meters apart. And we start walking. And we're walking quietly. We're looking around, but we're staying on the pavement. It's very important to stay on the pavement in Yugoslavia at that time. If you stepped off the pavement, just onto the shoulder of the road, that's where they put the anti-personnel mines. And Canada lost 23 soldiers, brave women, men and women during that period. And we lost 4 in the 6 months from my battalion when I was there. So we're paying attention. We're walking like soldiers do. And as we're getting closer, we're getting a few meters apart, more meters apart, probably 20, 25 meters apart. And you're looking at the person in front of you, occasionally look at the person behind you, and you're looking all around. When we get into town, we're even more careful. We're doing what you see soldiers do in movies. We're covering each other, moving from building to building. We're looking in the bombed out vehicles. We're looking in the backyards. There's occasionally a sliver of light coming through a window that has a blanket over it so they can not tell people they're there, not show people that they're there. And we quietly go by these windows because people have a life. They don't want to hear the soldiers. They don't want to hear us banging on their doors. All they want to know is that soldiers are on the street and they're going to do everything they can to keep the bad people out. Now, our objective on this patrol is to get to the town square. And I know if anybody on the call has spent time in Europe, I'm sure you have, and you drive through a small town, you'll normally see a square, a little area tiled off or cemented off. On the weekends, there's a market there. During the week, people might gather, occasionally do some sports in that area. And we're headed towards the town square of this little village. Again, majority of the houses are in ruins, but there's a few that are habitable, a few that people wanted to come back to. As we walk, it's quiet, it's quiet. Soldiers love their job when it's going well. So everybody in the audience loves their job when it's going well. Up until now, it's been a routine patrol. We've had no critical moments. And when I mean it's going well, it's not raining, it's warm, and it's quiet. Occasionally I hear a dog in the background, 20, I would say about 100 meters away. I remember there was 2 dogs that seemed to be calling back and forth to each other. I love dogs, I didn't mind that. Every now and then you'd hear a rifle shot, but it was far away. And you can tell that they weren't shooting at us. Soldiers know the sound of a rifle that's fired at them, what it sounds like when rounds go by you. It wasn't a problem. I had regular occurrence every few minutes in a war zone. Even in the quietest of days, you'll hear a rifle shot, multiple rifle shots every hour or so. But if I listen carefully, way in the distance, 20, 30 kilometers away, I can hear a rumbling of artillery. Again, that's okay. It's 20 or 30 kilometers away. They're not shelling us. We're having a routine patrol. We're doing what we've done for so many nights, for so many months. We finally get to the town square. I would say from the edge of the town to the town square was about 1 kilometer. Probably took us half an hour, 40 minutes to get there, very carefully. Moving actually quite quickly for that distance, but very carefully and very quietly. So we get to the town square. There's 4 of us, the sergeant, myself, and 2 soldiers, 2 privates, new to the military, fairly new, very well trained. Sergeant looks at me and he says to me, myself and the other soldier, he says, you guys take up a position behind this fence. There was a little stone fence that went around the town square that came up to about my waist. He said, take a position behind this fence. And what that means is kind of crouch down and start looking around and be ready to respond to anything that happens. Then he says, myself and the other private, the other soldier, we're going to take a walk around the town square. We're going to do a foot patrol. We'll be back in about 15 minutes. But he says to me, remember, I'll be back in 15 minutes. And if you hear anything, come running. If you hear anything, come running. Not an uncommon thing to say in a war zone. It is still a routine patrol. Private and I crouched down behind the fence. I believe we had our rifles on top of the fence. We would occasionally look up. Most of the time, we'd be just sitting up against it, listening. So 10 minutes goes by. I don't hear a sound, no problem. I'm looking at my watch all the time. 15 minutes go by. No sergeant, no problem. We're all not that great at estimating time. Maybe he said 15 minutes and it could have been back in 12, might not be back in 20. No problem. Quiet night. It's not raining. Like I say, rain's a big deal when you're a soldier. 20 minutes go by, nobody there, just myself and the soldier. Okay, 20 minutes isn't great, but 15, 20, what's the difference? 25 goes by. 25 is almost double of 15. I don't hear anything. So I stand up and I look around. You've all done this, kind of turn your head, kind of, put your hand over your ear and you're listening, you gotta hear something. There's debris everywhere. It's hard to walk, at any speed without, kicking a roof tile from a burned out house, or there's a lot of gravel on the pavement because, the streets aren't maintained. You hear your boots, crunching on the ground. I didn't hear anything. So I raised my rifle up to my shoulder and I look through my optical sight. We all have these little optical sights. You do that because at night, an optical sight gathers just a little more light and you can see just a little better. And I'm looking between the burned out buildings, trying to look in the burned out buildings that are on the other side of the square, and I can't see anything. I look at my watch and I notice it's been half an hour. And as I'm looking at my watch, I see past my watch and I see the private who's still crouched behind the stone fence. And he looks at me and our eyes locked just for a moment. When they did that, I felt a bit of a weight. I don't know if I moved physically. I know the air felt thicker. It was harder to breathe. And when he looked at me, I knew right away what he needed. He needed a decision. And he said it. He said, Master Corporal, what do we do? So that's a pretty critical moment. And I'd been trained for those. I'd been in the military for 10 years at that time, trained all the time. And you know how to respond. You're not even afraid. So I thought about it, a few seconds. I crouched back down and I said, we're going back to the track. Prepare to move. That's military talk for get ready because we're going. About 30's making sure we've got all our stuff on us. We're all buttoned up. Our flak jackets are buttoned up. We're ready. About 30 seconds go by and I use those two words that we respond to in the military. Move now. Okay. Took a while to get from the APC to that town square, but it seemed like it took forever to get back to the APC. We were so careful. It's just the two of us. Our leader's gone. Another soldier's gone. We're hoping the APC's still there. And maybe there's somebody we know, hopefully our driver, is still in the APC. So we're moving together slowly, about 5 meters apart at this time, being real careful, kind of getting a little too close. Then I look forward and I see something. I see this big square thing. And I'm pretty sure it's the APC because it's, there's no street lights, there's no nothing. So I go like this to the private, means, get down. So we're both on one knee. We have our rifles up to our shoulders. I'm in front. and I'm looking through my rifle. Not only do I see the APC now, but I see someone standing in front of it, about 20, 30 yards in front of it. I look carefully, trying to figure out who it is. And that person had the same uniform on that I had. The person looked like someone I'd seen recently. It was our sergeant. Don't know what happened. We still don't know. He probably went around the town square, decided to take a different route back, and was waiting for us at the APC. Now, it was a good decision to go back to the APC, not to wait in town. And he was happy with my decision. So that decision's important because there was only 2 radios. The sergeant had one, the APC had another. If I had to go looking for the sergeant, I wanted to be surrounded by that armored vehicle with a big 50 caliber machine gun, rather than just a flimsy flak vest and my little rifle. So there's 2 things I wanted you to remember when I tell this story. And of course, the story doesn't end there. Went on for months. That night even, I think we patrolled 2 more villages. Finally went back and got to sleep around 5, 6 in the morning. But the 2 things I asked you to remember was that you can't know what's going to happen until I tell you. Somebody needs to tell you the story, and so you can know it. You can't read my mind. Unless you've heard it before, you'll never know. I needed to tell you. The next thing I wanted you to remember is that I'd never met any of these soldiers until that night. Didn't know them. So the reason I'd never met them is I was not an infantry soldier in the military. For 11 years total in the military, I was an electronics technician. That's what I did. So the question should be, what's an electronics technician doing, heavily armed, at night, in a war zone with professional infantry soldiers? That's a good question. The military is very intentional about a few things, quite a few, but I'll just say a few. The first thing they're intentional about is your job. They've analyzed their business. They know operations. They know what everybody does, like we do in organizations. And they would say to me, and people like me in the military, you know, that electronics technician job you have, that's your day job. You really only have to be good enough most of the time at that. That's right. I only got to be good enough most of the time at being an electronics technician in the military. If I don't fix something well, if I can't fix something, I'm at a workbench with my test equipment, I'll figure it out. But they said, there's certain things where you can't make mistakes. So that routine job you have, being good enough most of the time, that's fine. But there may come a time when you have to keep yourself or someone else safe. And good enough most of the time in those moments is never enough. So we train and we train and we train. And in the moment, in those critical moments, we react. And that's what I did. It's quite, like I said, I was comfortable, just looked at the private and said, move now. And we made it back. So why tell this story? Like, why tell a story like that? Well, I never thought much about it. About a year after that night, well, I would say about 14 months after that night, I decided to leave the military. We're back in Canada for a year. And I was living in Calgary, Alberta, and I wanted to do something different with my life. I had all these adventures, critical moments, wonderful training in the military. I had a pretty high-tech job. And I'll also mention that, you know, when you think about soldiers, you often think it's the infantry soldier, but everybody's a soldier. It's soldier first, technician second. So at that night, how do I get all these experiences? Well, technicians like me had to go on patrol about once every 2 weeks with infantry soldiers. It wasn't good enough that I knew how to lead people. I had to, because I couldn't make a mistake. A lot of responsibility. So when I got back to Canada, living in Calgary, I thought, maybe I could do something else with my life. So I eventually went back to SAIT, wonderful institution, great opportunity there now to go during the day and meet with students. But I started a technical diploma and ended up getting a job right after I graduated. And I never thought much about that night in the former Yugoslavia. Sure, it was a trying time. Nobody got hurt that night. We all made it home safely. Yes, there was tragedy like there is in all war. Like I say, we lost 4 people in my battalion, but life moves on. I'd moved on past the military. I started managing very large projects, small ones at first, but then bigger ones, like I'm sure many people in the audience here, you get technical training, or perhaps it's business training, and then somebody sees how you're doing in your job and they give you a little more responsibility. And that was what was happening to me. I got a little more responsibility, slightly bigger projects. I think the first project I managed was probably $20,000. But about 6, 7 years into this career, I got to manage a really big project. Still, I was a new person. I wasn't that soldier anymore. I had moved on. I looked like I am today, a little younger back then, but yeah, I looked like this. Regular business person, technical person managing projects. But the big project they gave me, and it was a bit of a gift because I thought, man, this thing's big. I wonder who they're going to give this project to. And it turned out to be me. At that time, Alberta had one of the largest natural gas plants in North America. It's just west of Edmonton. And at that plant, our job was to replace the emergency shutdown system, a big programmable logic controller, it's called. Rooms and rooms in the control rooms. There's a big control room building, and then there's all these rooms in it that had racks full of little computer cards. And from there, there's wires that went out to the plant and connected to every valve, every temperature sensor, every pressure sensor. Security was also in that system. Rooms full of racks of computers, of computer cards, and then I think it was 3 rooms full of computers with people operating the plant, sitting at the computers, opening valves, checking temperatures, doing all that. But they said, we want you to replace this system without shutting the plant down. I said, okay, hadn't been done before. Small ones had been done, but this plant had 3,000, I think about 3,500, what we call physical I/O. That means physical input outputs into that system. And those are valves, temperature sensors, flow sensors, all these things in the plant. And if you're going to put a new system in while the plant is still running, there's some complex programming to be done. There's all kinds of safety procedures, so you can move one wire at a time. We had a plan, and I remember being overwhelmed. Almost every night, I'd come home, I'd tell my wife, man, this is a big project. I don't know if I'm really cut out for this. But you wake up the next day and you keep trying. That's what I was doing. I was trying to be successful at this massive project. So we hired a whole bunch of people. I think we had about 30 computer programmers. All the equipment's being ordered. The project at that time, this is about 2003, it's quite expensive. I think the budget started out at about 1.8 million for a control system, and we ended up between $4 and $5 million. So not a financial success, but I'll tell you, the project was successful. But I almost lost the project one day. One day, I get a call from an amazing, one of my kind of co-project managers. He was a contractor we brought on to help with the project management process, mostly on the safety side. Gave me a call, and he was at the staging area in Calgary. We had rented kind of a warehouse space at this vendor, control system vendor, and we had the whole upper floor, put in all systems out there to mimic what we had in the field location, and everybody's checking out the programming, doing all the programming, checking the procedure. If I pull this wire, will this shut down? How do we fix that? Getting ready to do the same thing in the field. But I get a call, and he says, Tom, you got to come down here. I was probably in the Calgary office. I can't remember. He says, you have to come down. I said, oh, what's the problem? He said, I think everybody's going to quit on us. And I said, what? They can't quit. I said, what do you mean everybody's going to quit? He says, millions of dollars, 30, 40 people. Pardon me. I got nervous. I thought, oh, I've lost it. This is the end of my career. Jumped in my nice company pickup truck. It was so wonderful. I love that truck. Drive to the control system vendor. go upstairs to the staging area, and I walk in and I say, where is everybody? Because it's just Ken Bingham, wonderful person who was there. He says, they're in the theater. I said, what do you mean the theater? He says, well, there's a theater downstairs that the vendor uses for events and shows people, new products. He said, they're all waiting for you in the theater. I said, well, what are they waiting for? He says, you got to talk to them. Okay. So I walk in and immediately I can feel, nobody said a thing, but I could feel that same weight that I had years ago in Yugoslavia. People were looking at me. And it was that look that I thought, oh man, the hair goes back up on the back of my neck when I think about it. They looked at me and they said, we can't do this. We're going to blow the whole place up. Remember, huge natural gas plant. I can't imagine the catastrophe would happen if this thing ever failed, caught fire. I mean, we see these incidents in the Gulf of Mexico and in southern Texas and all those places where there's these big industrial accidents. That's what they were afraid they were going to do. He said, yeah, sorry, we just can't do it. So I have all my programmers, engineers, technologists, IT people with advanced degrees and decades of management and engineering behind them. And I look at them, even though they said we can't do this, when they looked at me, I could tell it was that same look, that same moment, like from behind the fence. In that moment, I wasn't a project manager. I don't even know if I was a leader. In that moment, I had to do something. And coincidentally, I did the same thing that I did 10 years earlier behind that fence. I looked at them and I said, we're going to do this. Here's how we're going to do this. And I need your support. Not quite the same words, but in that moment, I spoke without even thinking about what I was going to say. In the end, what we did was bring everybody back from the plant to the staging area, all the technicians, and show our programmers the procedure we use so we can do this safely. That project took about 18 months to, we call it swinging every little piece over. The reason I tell both these stories is that nobody is born knowing what to do. Nobody's born knowing how to react behind a fence in a war zone at night where you're all afraid, maybe not consciously, but you're thinking about it, but you're going to get killed. Nobody's born knowing what to do. Same with that project. Nobody's born knowing what to do when your entire project team says they're quitting because they're terrified that, and rightfully so, that they're going to blow the whole plant up. I get it. But the reacting in the moment is something that we can train people for. We can do it. But I tell this leadership development industry, $20 billion a year, North American leadership development industry, that they're getting it wrong. They're okay in the routine, but my training in industry didn't prepare me for that moment. But my training in the military prepared me for the moment behind the fence. So what I ask people to do is trust your own leadership capability as an organization. You know in your organization what is critical in your job. You know what is critical for your clients. And if you want to bring in leadership development consultants, psychometric testing, get them to take a course, know this. Those consultants don't know. They don't know what's critical for you. They don't have your context, your experience. So you're going to have to do it yourself if you want to have success in critical moments. Don't worry about that. A lot of people say, well, I'm not a leadership development consultant. How can I do this? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Because there's one more thing that the military is very intentional about, and that's the primary role of every leader. The primary role of every leader in the military is to develop future leaders. The military doesn't bring in leadership development consultants to tell them how people should lead. the military does is they have their own leaders who have been there. They've had this experience, and they pass that on to the new leaders coming in, because it's so critical to pass on the critical moments to those critical people. So leadership in that way, when we work in industry, it's not about we have this position of authority and respect. We have this position in our organizations that people will expect something from us at the most critical times. So to wrap up this conversation, it's a one-way conversation so far, but I hope you've written down some questions. I'd like to show you how I occasionally help small organizations and medium-sized organizations move forward in their leadership development of their own people. And you certainly don't need me to do this. No organization needs me. So I just want to show you one more slide. It always takes me a moment here to bring up my slides. Just a moment. And it's basically a 3-step process that I follow. Should be coming up. There I am. Great. So the first step is I ask organizations to identify their own critical moments. You know what yours are. You have project experience. You have experience with your clients. You've watched people succeed and people fail, and maybe you've succeeded and failed in the past. Identify your critical moments for your organization. Once you do that, all of a sudden, it's actually the toughest thing to do next. And that toughest thing to do next is make a decision. Once you've identified your own critical moments, what I ask organizations to do is then decide if you're actually going to commit to training people how to succeed in those critical moments. Because that's a huge commitment. You might have identified them, but once you identify them, it's going to be a little overwhelming. Right away, decide if you're actually going to commit to making people successful in those moments. Most of you say, yeah, we would do that, but how? No problem. If you're committed to people being successful in critical moments in your company, in your industry, then create or demand leadership development that is focused on your critical moments, not just on generic leadership values, behaviors. I always say that we're already promoting good people. Everybody out there wants to do good work, and they're reasonable people. So training them in the routine is kind of like training them what they're already pretty good at, and training them into things they can make a mistake at every now and then. I say don't bother training people in routine leadership or being successful at the routine tasks. Know your critical moments. Decide to train people in your critical moments, then create or demand leadership development that is focused on your critical moments. So the last thing I always tell people is that I emphasize that it wasn't me. It wasn't something special that I had that helped me respond in that moment, both in Yugoslavia and 10 years later in that control system staging area in the theater with everybody looking at me. I was just fortunate that I was brought up in a system that focused leadership development on critical moments. I didn't get that training in industry. And it was probably by pure luck that in that moment, I responded like I did in that theater to keep everybody on that project and keep this multi-million-dollar project moving. I know that if we do this for everybody in our industries, in our companies, we will create a generation of leaders who, when being good enough most of the time is not enough, and when the consequences of failure are too high, they will respond and they will succeed in critical moments. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the time that you've given me to say this to you today. I would love to answer any questions or maybe elaborate on anything that I've said.
Thank you very much, Tom. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Lahiru Silva. I'll be your moderator for today, and thank you very much for your service and all the Canadian forces in the peacekeeping missions abroad around the world. We have a question from Ted Blackman, who is our keynote speaker. Ted, do you want to ask the question live? I can give you the mic. Okay, let me start with Ted's question. He's asking how often or how frequent you should identify the critical moments in a project, and how could you log track the decisions made on critical moments. And he also like to know how long you were in Yugoslavia.
Oh yeah, so I'll answer the easiest question first. 6 months. Tours were 6 months long. Of course, everybody is aware of how the world changed in the late 90s, where there was increasing conflict in the Middle East, and people in the military would spend 6 months in theater and then normally a few years without ever going anywhere. But as we've seen in the last couple of decades, there's so much conflict in the world that it was pretty much 6 months, a few months off, 6 months, and it kept going in the Middle East. But for me, it was only 6 months. Critical moments. Yeah, so what I ask is, if you can do it on a project by project basis, I think that's valuable. But I would offer that project managers in an organization can be mentored by senior project managers. And really, it's that in the moment response that we're really trying to create. I would offer that probably the only way to do it on a project by project basis is likely with respect to what we call mega projects. So I was fortunate after, or just before that project I talked about, I was on something called the Terra Nova project. It was building a big floating production and storage vessel offshore in Newfoundland. We built it in Korea. I was working in London doing a lot of working with the engineering teams. Now, on those projects, you've got a huge time horizon. You've got all this time, and you can mentor people in, here's the challenges we had with working in this country. Here's the challenges we've had with working with this supplier. And people can learn something and apply it over a year, 2 years. But most of us don't have that so-called luxury. Most of us move on, small project, we're managing multiple projects at one time. So we really have to take a broader mentoring approach. So a lot of the organizations I work with, they're either large process companies like fertilizer, oil and gas. So they've got a lot of in-house project managers and engineers, or engineering firms. And it really is taking what we call like a program approach. Somebody's going to have a suite of, say, control system projects, and a senior control system project manager may start mentoring new project managers and all the challenges, all the failures that have happened in the past. But it takes commitment, and it's a lot of work.
Thanks, Tom. We have another question from our Dean from School of Business, Janet. I'll let her have the mic so she can ask the question.
Thanks, Lahira. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. And I really appreciate your service and also you sharing your leadership thoughts today. So my question, you talked about critical moments, and it's something that I think about, and I found myself certainly experiencing it, but sometimes you don't realize in the lead up to a critical moment that it's going to become a critical moment. So I'm curious if you have tips on how do you raise that level of leadership awareness that you might see those critical moments coming and can make sure that you are able to be ready for it and lead well in that moment.
Yeah, and you know what, Janet, thanks for that question, because it's something that's come up before. It's like, I want to be ready for critical moments, but I can never see them coming. Absolutely. But there's people that you work with and that I work with that have been in my role before. They can pass on that organizational knowledge, that history. I'm very fortunate to work for one of your assistant chairs, or chair of the School of Business, Gersher. And I talk to Gersher quite frequently. I say, well, what do you do in these situations? And he'll say, well, here's what's happened in the past. Here's what good looks like. Here's what not so good looks like. And then all of a sudden, if we talk enough about that, my critical moments might be a little unique. There might be something that I bump into that he hasn't bumped into, but he's raised my awareness enough that I can react. So just having those conversations, and it has to be so intentional. It has to be such a long game. But if we can just have those conversations once a week, where everybody shares successes and failures, then we're more aware, we're more in tune. And then when it does happen to us, hopefully we've had enough conversations and we can react in that moment to help everybody out.
Thanks, Tom. That's great. And you can apply that across any industry or role or level of an organization.
Yeah, thank you.
We have time for one more question if one of you want to ask. Otherwise, we have a couple of questions in the chat. Okay, I'll go with one of the questions in the chat. That is, many project managers, even if they are not in the formal leadership role, are expected to influence others. And what advice you can give to people who are not expected to lead without authority?
Yeah, so we often hear that if we just had enough authority, we could, make a difference. And it doesn't work that way. The way that we advance as leaders, advance in the world of work, is we do something, and I'll go back to my military days, it's called we seek and accept responsibility. So we're always moving beyond what we're kind of allowed to do. And I don't mean that from a safety or ethical perspective, but we've only got so much authority. But the people that we want to promote are the people that find a way to lead without having that formal authority. And great leaders are always leading beyond their authority. And that's a real skill. So what I would ask somebody who said, I don't have enough authority, or I'm just, I'm new, I would say, start behaving like a leader. Start doing those things that leaders do. And I'll say that again, leaders are they're not always experts at their job. They may be technical experts, but they're the people who are already behaving like a leader. They're people who are able to reach out across the organization and engage people to do work without having formal authority. And they're people who are getting things done through other people very well, respectfully, ethically, without having to do anything themselves. When I see that happening, those people normally aren't too worried that they don't have formal authority. They just say, well, I seem to be able to get it done. Yeah, that's what we look for.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Yeah, thank you.
And on behalf of SAIT, as well as from the organizing committee, thank you very much for all your services, as well as having this wonderful keynote around leadership, as well as your experience in the military.
Thank you very much.
And for all the audience, we'll have the next sessions coming up around 1:20. We have 3 breakout sessions. One around productivity of teams online by one of the popular speakers, Faith Wood, in the Project Management Institute community. And we have Bill Black, the president of the Calgary Construction Association, talking about cost escalation and supply chain and managing the new uncertainty. And then we have another panel discussion around Internet of Things by Anne Lewis, as well as Hamad Chowdhury and Dazi Black. So thank you very much for all of you joining, and we will share the PDU claim codes as well as the recording details next week with all the attendees. And we'll have this channel open for another 2-3 minutes, and please log into the other breakout rooms. And thank you very much, Tom, for joining with us.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.